Lucky Luciano, the architect of organized crime. Lucky Luciano is the reason we have cinematic gems like The Goodfellas and The Godfather. Lucky looked at the decades-old feuds of the old Italian crime families, all that bad blood, the turf wars, and the murders, and he decided to change the rules of the game completely. Somehow, Lucky managed to accomplish the impossible. He brought the biggest crime families together and made them aware of the only truth that really mattered. Settling old scores was keeping them from seeing the true goal, that everyone's eye should be on the one and only true prize, making boatloads of money, and more than any of them could ever imagine. Lucky Luciano is the reason that the words syndicate and organized crime even exist. Before the drug lords of Colombia, before any semblance of order existed among criminal families, it was Lucky who brought the underworld out from the common Depression-era bank robbers, adding class, opulence, and order to crime that the world had never seen before. Salvatore Luciano was born in Italy in 1897. The exact day of his birth is still disputed, but all we know is that it was sometime in November. The family was working class at best, and their circumstances did not improve by much when they moved to America when little Salvador was just 9 years old. Rosalia and Antonio Luciana settled with their 4 children in New York's Lower East Side, and the place was rough to say the least. Gangs ran the streets, and garbage overflowed on the sidewalks. Constant turf wars, child bandits, and gunslinging robbers were in charge, each group operating strictly with their own kind. The Irish stayed with the Irish, the Jews kept to themselves, and the Italians did not mix with the rest. Salvatore grew up alongside Jewish, Irish, and his own Italian immigrants. He went to school sitting shoulder to shoulder with children of all backgrounds, and he learned quickly that your background made no difference to your success or failure. Salvatore had none of the prejudices that his parents and the older generation did at the time. He judged no man, woman, or child by their ethnicity, only by their character. At an early age, he proved himself to be an opportunist. Seeing that the Jewish children were often the target of anti-Semitic attacks and muggings, little Salvatore, leading his own gang of budding juvenile criminals, offered a protection service to these children. For a fee, of course, and he and his gang would fight tooth and nail to protect anyone willing to pay for it. In his free time, Salvatore shoplifted and got into the usual scuffles that raged in the underbelly of New York. He weaved his way among the old crime families that fled from Europe to America and became intricately familiar with them all. He spent a few months in a juvenile facility for troubled teens, and when he stepped out at 14, he actually got himself a legal job as a delivery boy for a hat store, earning $5 a week. In his 14th year came the light bulb moment that would later spur the lower-level teenage hooligan to become the greatest mob boss in history. It was just a dice game that Luciano bet his weekly wages on. Instead of losing his coins, he walked away with $250 in his pocket. All of the fear pumped into him at the teenage prison that had him on the straight and narrow for all of half a year left him right then and there. There were much easier ways to earn a living, and the money that was out there was just waiting for Salvatore to reap it up. He quit his job and started up his racketeering business again, this time adding to his repertoire, drug running for bigger guns on the streets. He left home after his father found a gun in his bedroom drawer and moved in with an already seasoned criminal named Joe Biondo. He continued to live a hard life, making his way by the laws of the underground for another 3 years. He managed to keep his record reasonably clean until the age of 18, that is, when he was finally caught selling heroin to an undercover cop. That mugshot would become synonymous with Lucky Luciano, the picture that every person in America came to recognize as the biggest mob boss of the time. After prison, he changed his name to Charles and decided to go clean again for a few months by working at a shipping yard. But the streets and the criminality were in Charles's blood now. Like a moth to a flame, he just couldn't resist. The name Lucky wouldn't come around until much later, so for now, Charles Luciano was just Charles or Charlie to those he sat at the same table with. And a lot of people got to call him Charlie because Luciano sure had a lot of friends. For the next few years, Charles's dealings are murky and mysterious. All we know is that he rounded up his childhood friends that he ran his racketeering scheme with back in the day while he worked for various big gangsters. Unlike the people he worked for, Luciano had no qualms about what his business partners' ethnicities were. The money came first, and it always would. Then 1920 came, and with it, Prohibition. This is where Luciano went from a delinquent sewer rat to a master malefactor. His liquor store robbings ran dry with the new alcohol restrictions in place, so Luciano called up his old roommate, Joe Biondo. Together they stole or bought industrial alcohol to make bootleg whiskey. They bribed their way into perfume factories or just simply gunned their way in to steal that ethanol too. But Charles didn't keep it all for himself. He was generous enough to sell the brewery equipment to anyone who wanted to get into the booming business that was the illegal booze trade. The operation got so big that Luciano got some warehouses and set up entire breweries to keep up with demand. Big names were so invested in the illegal breweries that Luciano called some surprising names friends. We need to reiterate, in those times, gangsters didn't mix. You had your people, your street, and your community, and if you crossed onto someone else's turf, you'd end up swimming with the fishes. The Jewish and Irish bosses dealt with Charles personally, and Charles's own Italians were even more fond of him. Thanks to Joe Biondo, who was related to the infamous Gambino family, Luciano had an automatic in with them. Their enemies, the Moretti family, were just as cozy with Charles. When there was money to be made, nobody cared who the supplier dealt with. But this unique position, right between factions that usually were at war with each other, gave old Charlie an edge that no one else had at the time. He was on good terms with everyone. High, low, east or west, anyone who was anyone knew Charles and did business with him. He was important and rich enough that he had the right to sit at the boss's tables. And thanks to the friends he made as a kid and his old roommate Biondo, he had an in with some seriously powerful leaders, with some of the most prominent crime families. But the most beneficial Italian friendship Lucky had was Joe Masseria. This guy controlled the entire east side of New York and was probably one of the most powerful criminals at the time. Luciano was hired as Masseria's personal gunman, and with that paycheck added to his bootleg operation, Charles was living large and rolling in dough, much more so than the other small-timers were. But in 1922, Masseria was assassinated by a rival gang, and Luciano's strongest ally lay dead. Luciano and two other gunmen went along to a set-up meeting to meet with their deceased boss's killer, a man named Valentini Maranzano. They killed him, and Charles was the one to fire the bullet that took Maranzano's life. Luciano's willingness to kill a man for the Masseria gang served as his initiation, and he was welcomed with open arms. For the first time, Luciano was part of an official mafia family, no longer just a hired gun, and something he'd managed to expertly avoid up to this point. With that entrance into a mob family also came the politics of the mob, something Charles had never had to deal with. It also put a target on his back. Your family protected you, but being a part of that family in the first place is what put you in the danger that you now needed protecting from. Then there were the in-house plays for power and dominance that Luciano was introduced to. He'd always played by his own rules, making as many friends as he could along the way. But now, his friends couldn't associate with him openly anymore, and he had to play by the family's laws. The killing of Valentini and Masseria started an all-out war between the two factions for the next 2 years. Charles, now a capo for the Masseria family, had his hands too full with the responsibilities of being a captain. There was no time to dwell too much on his distaste for how things were being run when he was constantly keeping an eye over his shoulder and making sure business was running smoothly, both his own side hustles and the family's. Luciano managed to keep his contacts with the Irish and Jewish gangs open under the guise of business. His distilleries ran through them all. He just couldn't keep an open line between some of the Italian gangs that were on bad terms with the Masserias anymore. And since he avoided the bad blood and was making a ton of money through the rest, the Masserias didn't care too much, as long as Charles stayed on their side of the fence when it mattered. Money is money after all. But a bust in 1923 got Luciano into murky waters with his new family. He'd gotten caught selling heroin again by an undercover cop. He didn't rat anyone out, but in order to stay out of prison, Luciano gave up the location of his own enormous drug stash hidden in a warehouse. The Masseria family wasn't happy. A deal with the cops is a deal with the cops. It didn't matter that Luciano only did himself in. That deal with authorities made him tainted. Charles wasn't banished or punished for his actions, but for the rest of the Masseria-Maranzano War, he remained in everyone's sights under constant supervision. It was around this time that the paper started calling him Lucky. The story told in the movies about how he'd survived a brutal interrogation by the FBI is a complete fabrication. The papers in those days relied heavily on their reporting of criminals. It started with the Depression bank robbers. The baddies were salacious and sparked the imaginations of people who were living in deplorable conditions. They were the celebrities of their day, and Lucky, in his habit of getting off scot-free, even though he was supplying most of New York with booze and drugs, was every bit of the handsome mobster the public loved to read about. And speaking of the press, the Masseria-Maranzano War was making headlines. The war was heating up. Long gone were the days when the two factions were satisfied with shooting down each other's bootleg trucks, or maybe a fistfight if they ran into each other at a bar. Now it was escalating to assassinations every few weeks. And big names are being brought down. Even the original mafia back in Italy were aware of the fighting. Lucky was having nothing of the feud. He wanted to make money, and there was no dough to be made from killing a man. He went to Germany in 1930 to set up a drug chain from the US to the Reich. But the tension and the poverty there wasn't Lucky's scene either, so he returned home, but not before he made some friends in Europe first. The war had deteriorated drastically by the time he got back, and Masseria was at the losing end, but he was just too proud to throw in the towel. Maranzano actually wanted to negotiate peace, but Masseria wouldn't hear a thing about peaceful talks. So Lucky took matters into his own hands. With all the bloodshed and death, everyone's bootleg businesses were starting to suffer. No one could move their spirits from the breweries because the delivery vans were under constant siege. And with every death, the fuzz swarmed onto the scene, and those investigations inevitably led to the discovery of dozens of breweries and thousands of dollars worth of drugs. Lucky was in the business of making money, not losing it to the pigs. So he contacted Maranzano, and they conspired to kill Masseria, Lucky's own boss. Instead of going underground for fear of retaliation from his own people for the betrayal, Lucky took full responsibility for killing Joe the Boss Masseria, and if anyone, including Maranzano, dared take responsibility for it, the war would commence. And this time Lucky was in charge, and he wasn't going to hold back. He made it crystal clear. This heinous act was for the good of everyone on the underground. Masseria's pride was putting everyone out of business. And what was loyalty if your people were starving and being shot down on the street like dogs? His bold declarations worked. He gained the respect of most in the Masseria clan. What he was saying was true after all. But he couldn't pull off a takeover of these proportions without making quite a few enemies too. The few who disagreed were driven by habit and tradition, more so than logic. And if Maranzano ever thought he had a stooge who'd be willing to do his dirty work for him like a lapdog, then he was sorely wrong. Lucky was a man to be reckoned with, and Lucky sure wasn't no dog. Lucky Luciano didn't stop there. He did something that had never been done before in the history of the American mob. He called all the Sicilian families together in one room, and he chided them like children, forcing them to behave. Never mind that half of them were at war with each other. He started off the evening with a celebration of his victory, essentially showing Maranzano who was truly in charge here. And the fact that everyone there followed Lucky's lead puts Maranzano a step lower than Lucky. He announced his takeover of the Masseria family, also renaming it to the Genovese family. The Genovese name was a throwback to a former boss in the business, but that's a video for another day. Then Luciano concluded the changes by stating that a council would be formed headed by the 5 biggest and most powerful families. Each would have a boss and a second in command to represent them. The 5 family bosses were made up of Joseph Bonanno of the Bonanno family, Tommy Lucchese of the Luccheses, Joe Profaci was the head of the Colombo family, Vincent Mangano was of the Gambino family, and obviously Lucky Luciano was on the seat of representatives as the new head of the newly minted Genovese family. His second in command was Vito Genovese. And then Lucky made a surprising call. At the head of them all was Maranzano, now carrying the title, the boss of all bosses. This was a genius move. Lucky restructured the entire mob, bringing everyone under one roof. Everyone that mattered had a seat of power, and the one with the biggest guns and the most numbers, who had every reason to be annoyed with Lucky for calling the shots and potentially usurping his position in the hierarchy, was given the presidency, so to speak. Maranzano couldn't refuse the offer, and the other bosses had nothing to lose and everything to gain from falling in line. Actually, they all had something to gain from this new, almost constitutional system. The newly minted crime syndicate of New York made warring among factions obsolete, or the most important ones, with the most firepower and pull behind them at least. And by working together, combining their territories and streams of income, business opportunities, and a more fair distribution of resources. This was unprecedented. Never before had the crime families, who were up until this point literally at war with each other, created a unified working system, essentially creating a constitution. This generation of Sicilians was raised in America, with much more freedom of opinion and choice than their forefathers who were under the dictatorship of Mussolini back in Italy. But Maranzano was a traditionalist. Even with the biggest role in the syndicate, he just couldn't let old feuds lie. Sitting around the table with his former enemies was just too much for him to swallow. So he created a list of people he felt he needed to take out, planning on taking all the power once again. A mob Mussolini, if you will. A lot of the people on that list were on the council. Lucky was on his list too, but no way was he going to allow the young gun to call the shots. The rest were a collection of big names like Al Capone and a few Jewish mobsters. But before the hitman could start cashing in on the bounties, Lucky found out about the list. He brought everyone on that list together, whether they were friends or foes, and proved that Maranzano planned to kill them all. The night of the Sicilian Suffer was executed. Lucky sent his men to kill Maranzano in his office, and at the same time, half a dozen of Maranzano's most loyal henchmen were taken down too. The boss lay dead on the floor, and with his death, died the title, Boss of All Bosses. Lucky only allowed the title out of respect, and to get Maranzano to take a place at the council. He wasn't going to give one man too much power ever again. Milano of Cleveland and Capone of Chicago joined the council, now numbering 7, and they would mediate and make final decisions or dole out punishments when the families had disputes amongst each other. 1930 to 1936 was the Luciano era. Lucky was now the head of his own house, no longer doing the bidding of a boss. And as a boss himself, he set out to do what he did best: make boatloads of money. And man, did he profit. Luciano was a little different than the other bosses. For one, he did not live lavishly. The man didn't even own a house. He operated under fake identities, slept in hotels, and conducted his business in private. People like Al Capone dabbled in politics and rigged elections. He threw parties and rubbed shoulders with celebrities, and he didn't shy away from the press. But Lucky wanted none of that attention. He preferred to leave the theatrics to the rest and focus on getting rich instead. This is why it took so long for authorities to realize just how enormous his operations had become. Prohibition was now over, so he focused on drugs and prostitution instead. Those were his biggest streams of income by far. He approached Europe again to streamline the drug smuggling, and this time he was more successful, coupled with the heavy demand of Hollywood, way out on the West Coast. Lucky made more millions than he could keep track of. The West Coast was on another boss's turf, but Lucky was on most people's good side, so he made the hustle work. That's not to say that he didn't have enemies, but for the majority of the time, he had the respect and friendship of others in the syndicate. Lucky's brothels got the biggest overhaul. He structured it like the mob. The girls paid their madams a cut, the madams paid the bookies a cut, and after the bookkeeper took his percentage, the boss got the rest. New York's brothels were no longer a lower-end alleyway affair. Lucky made it classy, seeking out only the prettiest girls. But make no mistake, here's where the mobster's true colors came out, when he worked with women. The brothels were nothing short of human trafficking. His underlings sought out young, good-looking women who were going through hard times, and then they plied them with the drugs, enough to get them hooked, and lent them money that they needed to then pay back. With a ton of interest, the women were passed around, making only enough to feed their habit and not much more than that, and all the money they made was paid right back to Lucky by buying his drugs. Beatings, rape, and blackmail were used to keep the girls in line, and they lived in a constant state of fear. Then a prosecutor by the name of Thomas Dewey walks into the picture, and soon the mafia couldn't buy their way out of jail anymore. Dewey convicted a few middlemen in the mob, and then, when he looked at their books, his jaw hit the floor. Even the stooges were making more money than anyone had even realized. He'd known the upper heads and the bosses were rolling in cash, but if their underlings were bringing in this kind of money, then what the hell were the big guys making? Dewey sank his teeth into the mob, determined to bring them all down. His main form of attack was tax evasion, and it got a heck of a lot of people behind bars. This spread a new wave of chaos among the factions, with their bosses on the run, laying low or in jail, and there was once again open warfare. People were clamoring to get themselves on the newly vacated thrones left behind. His discoveries and the tabloid headlining arrest he made led to a campaign of mudslinging from Dewey. Dewey started spreading the word of the evil syndicates on every radio station that would have him, shattering the public's Hollywood-esque idea of the gangsters. He went after Dutch Schultz, a Jewish kingpin and bootlegger, driving Dutch into hiding. Dutch started losing control of his house due to his absences and his growing paranoia. His people just had no trust left in their unpredictable leader anymore. Lucky saw this as an opportunity to grow his own house by combining it with Dutch's. Luciano convinced Dutch's own people to assassinate him. Dewey was furious. He'd wanted Dutch's head on a spike for himself, and Lucky took it from him. He'd been aware of the Italian before, but Lucky's habit of staying in the shadows hid the true scope of his wealth and power. But that smokescreen that Lucky hid behind started to fall apart when Dewey, fueled by revenge, started looking into Lucky more. Witnesses in New York told Dewey about the brothels, and he soon discovered just how enormous the industry was. Luciano, realizing that the heat was on, fled to Arkansas with the intention of fleeing to Mexico from there. But Dewey had him arrested before Lucky could make it across the border. Dewey managed to keep Lucky in jail until he could be brought to New York to stand trial. Luciano's lawyers fighting him every step of the way. But in the end, Lucky was slapped with a 30-year sentence. Vito Genovese took over for a while, but Dewey was already hounding him too, forcing Genovese to flee back to Italy. The next one to take the throne was Frank Costello. But unlike Genovese, who wanted all the power for himself, Costello worked with Lucky to keep the empire running. Lucky had just as much power from behind bars as he did as a free man, thanks to the fact that he kept such good relationships with the people who were most likely to become his enemies. He had his financial affairs and the lid of control in place outside the prison, while Lucky and his lawyers filed appeal after appeal. For nearly 5 years, Luciano tried to get out by legal means. That is, until World War II broke out. The U.S. needed to get their ports and sea routes protected, and since the mob controlled almost every harbor and port in the country, the military feared that double agents would give over locations of warships and weak points to the enemy. Luckily, most of the mob bosses fled Italy back then because of the tightening restraints placed on them by dictators like Mussolini. The mob and the military could at least agree on one thing: the dictators in Europe and Japan had to be taken care of. The U.S. government rolled out a deal to the bosses in prison, which all of them happily took. Help the war efforts and keep the port safe, and none of them would be deported back to Italy when their sentences were done. Lucky was one of the bosses that got this deal in 1942. It wasn't exactly freedom, but it at least kept him out of Italy and still within the country where he had the most power. Lucky was invaluable to U.S. intelligence. He put them in contact with the underground operation still running in Italy, and he had inside information about Germany's backdoors too. Lucky's dealings with the military were kept on the down low, and in return the military made sure that Lucky's reputation as the architect of the mafia stayed intact. Heck, they even spread rumors of his viciousness, wealth, and power that were incredibly overblown to add to Luciano's reputation and the respect that infamy came with. He got freedoms that no one else did, and his people could have private meetings with him, making it possible to run his affairs even more efficiently from behind bars than ever before. When the war ended, the feds didn't keep their end of the bargain. All of the mobsters were extradited back to Italy anyway. With Mussolini now gone, most of them were perfectly happy to go back. In 1946, Lucky's associates came to see him off when he was deported. From Italy, Luciano was too far away to run the empire he'd put his blood, sweat, and bullets into, and he had no access to his money. But he still had a few people willing to help him get back to the US. Before the year was even out, Lucky Luciano landed in Cuba. The FBI got wind of his plans to get back to the US, but Lucky left a false trail that he was going to enter the States through Mexico. So with all their attention on Mexico, Lucky was able to slip in undetected. And thanks to the corrupt Cuban government that was being paid off by the mob, they even supplied Lucky with a perfectly legal visa for his stay. Luciano fell in with the various Havana mafia houses, and with his money now back under his control, he had quite a bit of pull in Cuba. Besides, the Cuban houses took the structure for their factions, which fell under a council manned by a handful of families, right from the book that Lucky wrote when he created the Sicilian Syndicate. He came into Cuba with respect and reverence that few outsiders get to have. However, Cuba was a state of the US at the time, meaning that America had some legal pull in the country. The FBI tracked him down in just a few months and sent him right back to Italy in March of 1947. Lucky spent almost 3 weeks in custody when he arrived in Italy, and after his release, he went to Rome. From there, he traveled all over Europe, getting in touch with the biggest heroin producers on the continent. The plan was to set up drug trades out of Italy and into the US. Unfortunately for Luciano, the FBI was completely aware of his travels and subsequent plans, and Italian authorities hounded him like dogs. His every move was being watched, everyone just waiting for him to slip up. Now there was none of the anonymity he'd enjoyed in the early days. To make matters worse, the Italian mafioso wanted nothing to do with Luciano. By now, everyone knew about him helping the military, besmirching his reputation even more. Police took away his passport and put Lucky under curfew restrictions. If he so much as sneezed the wrong way, police or the Italian mob would jump on him. The only reason the mob hadn't killed him the moment he arrived was because Lucky was good friends with a big boss in Italy called Vicini. But now this was only enough to keep Lucky alive. The Italians treated him with open animosity and disgust. Now in his 60s, Luciano wasn't coping with the hard times very well. The stress of his worsening financial situation and the constant harassment by Italian authorities were starting to weigh on Luciano. He lost quite a bit of weight and developed a heart condition. The money his friends in the US had been sending him was drying up, and his Cuban investments were crushed with the revolution taking place in the country. Desperate, Lucky met with writers and filmmakers to produce a book and a movie about his life. In 1961, he signed a contract that would pay out $100,000 when the film came out, and the mafia were fuming. They made it clear, if that film hit the screens, Lucky was as good as dead. What few friends he managed to hang on to all turned their backs on their former boss when they heard about the film. Lucky tried to back out of the contract, and it was during one of these meetings to get out of the deal that he collapsed. Luciano drove to the airport to pick up a film producer who'd come to Italy with the hope that he could convince Lucky to go through with the deal after all. But when Lucky arrived, he suffered a massive heart attack. At the age of 64, Charles Luciano lay dead in the airport, and Lucky's luck had finally run out. More police showed up to his funeral than any of his former associates. The ones who did show up were only his family and some small-time crooks. The bosses in the state sent money to fund the proceedings, so at least Luciano was buried with as much style and opulence as he'd lived in during his heyday. Luciano's remains were sent to the US, where he was laid to rest in the family crypt. Charles Lucky Luciano is still considered the architect of the mafia, once one of the most powerful men in the United States, only to end up in near poverty and squalor, desperate to make just one more deal.